Chapter 3, Polity. The cultural politics of the Adamic narrative. For all the scorn poured on La Pereire and the idea of non-Adamic races, the political significance of the narrative of human origins and diversity reasserted itself with ever greater force during the 18th century. Certainly, refutations continued to surface, itemizing the strategies that several of his critics mounted in their effort to preserve received wisdom about Adam as the father of all humankind will help to convey something of the disquiet La Pereire's heresy continued to induce. These reflections will serve as background to a consideration of debates congregating around the role that climate was thought to play in the processes of racial differentiation. The politicization of human origins that preoccupied pre-Adamism's proponents and detractors throughout the 18th century will thereafter command attention as we examine something of the ways in which scientific inquiry, linguistic diversification, moral philosophy, race relations, and cultural politics were intimately interwoven. Criticism and conjecture. In 1718 the French Catholic apologist and Orientalist Eusebius Renet used his translation of two ancient Arabic travelers to snipe at La Pereire's theory. Numbered among those chronologists who had put weapons into the hands of libertines and freethinkers, he told the readers of his appended dissertation on Chinese learning, was the author of the pre-Adamite system. Although La Pereire's acquaintances themselves reported that he was so ignorant that he scarce understood Latin, yet having formed a system by wresting some passages of Scripture to his own mind, he laid hold on it not only as a very valid proof of his own whims, but also of the infinite number of years the Assyrians, Babylonians, and Egyptians reckoned, which the very heathens themselves rejected as fabulous. Many had been ensnared thereby, Renet judged, not to become pre-Adamites indeed, but to harbor other notions equally subversive of religion. Still, those who sought, even with seeming casualness, to refute the speculation found themselves having to multiply ever more extreme conjectures in the effort to preserve literal readings of the Genesis text. Illustrative here was the doctrinal conspectus by the minister of the Independent Church at Three Cranes in London, Thomas Ridgely. A proponent of strict Calvinism, Ridgely rejected what he saw as various liberalizing tendencies in the Anglican Church and produced a number of publications on creed-making and other religious subjects. In his two-volume Body of Divinity of 1731, Ridgely turned his readers' attention to the Adamic origins of the human race and paused to attack the bold writer who about the middle of the last century, published a book, in which he advanced a new and fabulous notion, that there was a world of men, who lived before Adam was created, and that these were all heathen, and that Moses speaks of their creation, as what was many ages before Adam, in general and of Adams in chap. 2. Whom he supposes to have been created in some part of the world, which was then uninhabited. Ridgely found this theory offensive and subversive of the entire doctrinal structure of Christianity, and it was therefore no surprise to him that, even though Pereire's book was not much known in the world, yet the notion is propagated and defended by many atheists and deists. Accordingly, he felt compelled to attack the idea in several catechetical responses to questions about the Adamic world. And here the need for increasingly speculative extravagance to save biblical appearances manifested itself. In seeking to explain global demography, for example, and to account for the populating of Cain's city from Adam's own offspring, Ridgely resorted to what might best be described as Edenic hyperfecundity. In primeval days, he surmised, procreation took place in an uncommon degree, the necessity of things requiring it. Indeed, he did not consider it absurd to suppose, that, at least, as many children were generally born at a birth, and in as early an age of the mother's life, as have been or are, in any uncommon instances in later ages. In addition to this natal prodigality, Ridgely added that the time of childbearing continued many years longer than it now doth. And, if the age of man was extended to 800 or 900 years, we may conclude that there were but few that died young. Ridgely was certain that by such means, in a relatively short space of time, Adam's offspring might spread themselves through many countries, far distant from the place where Adam dwelt, and therefore there is no need to suppose, that those, with whom Cain dwelt in the land of Nod, were persons that lived before Adam was created. The anonymous authors of An Universal History, which began to appear in London in 1736, likewise resorted, in part, to what they called primitive fecundity in order to account for the growth of population in the Adamic world. And this explanation, together with the power of climate to induce organic modifications, was called upon to preserve intact the standard biblical story in the face of those who think mankind were in being before Adam. Indeed, these writers, specifically attacking the idea that Moses intended only to give an account of the origin of the Jews, as put forward by La Pereire and Blunt, express their disquiet at the insistence of the pre-Adamites that both white and black races could not have descended from Adam and Eve. Arguing that climate was sufficiently powerful to bring about changes in complexion, they went on to advance an account of racial differentiation in terms of what, perhaps a little anachronistically, might be called sexual selection and psychic influence. After the initial change in skin tone that any group might experience in moving to a very hot country, the authors conjectured that in a generation or two, that high degree of tawniness might become natural and at length the pride of the natives. The men might begin to value themselves upon this complexion, and the women to affect them the better for it, so that their love for their husbands, and daily conversation with them, might have a considerable influence upon the fruit of their wombs, and make each child grown blacker and blacker, according to the fancy and imagination of the mother. This explanation, the authors were convinced, was infinitely superior to those accounts explaining that blackness was at first supernatural, and a judgment inflicted upon Ham. Evidently, as the 18th century wore on, questions about human origins and the status of Adam as the father of all humanity spread well beyond matters of theological heterodoxy and scientific explanation and further into the realms of national politics, social relations, and moral philosophy. The reason for this shift, of course, is that the Adamic narrative not only laid out some of the foundations of civil society, marriage, family, agriculture, ritual, urban life, but also delivered a universal anthropology that knit together, in one way or another, every human being regardless of racial, religious, ethnic, or national identity. Tampering with that received story was itself a political intervention, the implications of which were the subject of concern to various interlocutors. Here we focus on the period somewhat casually referred to as the Enlightenment in hopes of disentangling some of the differing threads woven into what I call Adamic politics on both sides of the Atlantic and to disclose something of the continuing political investment in the chronicle of Adam and his descendants. For challenging the traditional story was taken to have monumental social implications that were every bit as far-reaching as its theological connotations. Climate's imperial power. It was in the 14th book of his celebrated 1748 work on comparative governmental institutions that the French political theorist Montesquieu elaborated on what might best be called the imperialism of climate. To him everything from human physiology and national character to social customs and moral standards bore the indelible stamp of regional climate. It was Montesquieu's familiarity with the physiological theories of figures such as Boerhaave that encouraged him to conceive of the nervous system as consisting of tiny tubules that carried what he referred to as animal spirits, or nerve fluid, around the body. This understanding of the human constitution allowed him to speculate that, for example, inhabitants of cold climates were more vigorous because the fibers in their cardiovascular systems contracted in cold air and stimulated faster flowing of the blood. Warm air, by contrast, relaxed and lengthened the extremes of the fibers. The implications were far-reaching. It meant that people are therefore more vigorous in cold climates. Here the action of the heart and the reaction of the extremities of the fibers are better performed, the temperature of the humors is greater, the blood moves freer towards the heart, and reciprocally the heart has more power. This superiority of strength must produce a great many effects, for instance, a greater boldness, that is more courage, a greater sense of superiority, more frankness, less suspicion, policy, and cunning. By contrast, the inhabitants of warm climates were, like old men, timorous. Evidently, the force of climate was as irresistible as the might of an omnipotent imperial power. As Montesquieu famously put it in a later section of his celebrated treatise, the empire of the climate is the first, the most powerful of all empires. In one sphere after another Montesquieu elaborated on the imperatives of climate, for education, law, religion, customs, diet, agriculture. In so doing, he compared the national character of India with China, much to the detriment of the former. He proposed as a natural law that, in moving from the equator to the poles, drunkenness increased together with a degree of latitude, and he found differences in attitudes to suicide between the Romans and the English. In climate, then, lay the sources of human variation. What looked like inherent racial differences were simply the outworkings of climate's imperial agency. This view caught on. During the middle decades of the 18th century, Georges Buffon added his voice in support of the omnipotent agency of climate in producing human differences. The influence of climate, food, which has a great dependence on climate, and manners, on which climate has, perhaps, a still greater influence were, to Buffon, the three fundamental causes of racial variety. Indeed, the human constitution was remarkably pliant before the iron hand of climate. Human migration, Buffon believed, provided ample testimony. Under different regimes human nature was subject to various alterations. In the New World, he famously insisted, much to the irritation of Thomas Jefferson, An inferior climate inevitably produced a degenerate anthropology, a mediocre zoology, and a substandard botany. But these differences were not inherent, they were derived. So, while on the surface it might look as though the Negro, the Laplander, and the white were really different species, in fact those marks which distinguish men who inhabit different regions of the earth, are not original, but purely superficial. It is the same identical being who is varnished with black under the torrid zone, and tanned and contracted by extreme cold under the polar circle. Later in the century Johann Friedrich Blumenbach added his voice to the environmentalist chorus, arguing in his medical doctoral thesis, completed in 1775 and going into its third edition in 1795, that racial divergence was due to the influence of climate and habitat. What he called the continuous action, carried on for several series of generations, of some peculiar stimuli in organic bodies, notably, climate, was such that firm lines of racial difference could never be drawn. Although there seems to be so great a difference between widely separate nations, that you might easily take the inhabitants of the Cape of Good Hope, the Greenlanders, and the Circassians for so many different species of man, he wrote, yet when the matter is thoroughly considered, you see that all do so run into one another, and that one variety of mankind does so sensibly pass into the other, that you cannot mark out limits between them. For a rather more popular audience, the celebrated Anglo-Irish man of letters and sometime physician Oliver Goldsmith turned the attention of the readers of his History of the Earth, which first came out the year he died, 1774, to the subject of the varieties of the human race. Goldsmith was convinced that there is nothing in the shape, nothing in the faculties, that shows their coming from different originals, and the varieties of climate, of nourishment, and custom, are sufficient to produce every change. In holding this view, he sided with the 17th-century merchant and Oriental traveler Sir John Chardin, whom he quoted as confirming that all nations are derived from the same original, however different either their complexion or their manners may appear, for as to the complexion, that proceeds entirely from the climate and the food. He thus was unpersuaded by those who sought to attribute black skins to causes other than climate. Such ungrounded conjecture must be rejected in favor of the ancient opinion, that the deepness of the color proceeds from the excessive heat of the climate. Both reason and religion, Goldsmith happily concluded, conspired to confirm that we have all sprung from one common parent and that a kinder climate would eventually obliterate the accidental deformities that he believed separated African, Asian, and American peoples from more civilized races. By environmentalist strategy, then, the traditional Christian belief in human monogenesis could be sustained. A single human species had simply diversified under the evolutionary influence of differing climatic conditions. The empire of climate preserved the unity of the human race. Evolution, as it were, saves Scripture. And in so doing, as we will presently note, it also went some way toward giving sustenance to those who opposed slavery, by combating writers who erected racial classifications on polygynist foundations. Races for places. Henry Home, Lord Kames, the Scottish lawyer and philosopher, did not see things the same way at all. Indeed, some of the commentators noted earlier had Kames in their crosshairs when they issued robust defenses of biblical monogenism. With a distinguished reputation as a leading legal authority already secured and a long-standing involvement in agricultural and commercial affairs behind him, he turned his attention in his late 70s to the question of human history. In 1774, at the height of the Scottish Enlightenment, his famous Sketches of the History of Man first appeared, with variant editions surfacing in the United States. The treatise's preliminary discourse constituted a lengthy attack on the power of climate to explain human variation and a robust denial of the organic unity of the human race. And in declaring war on the empire of climate, Kames considered his most formidable antagonist to be the celebrated Montesquieu, that great champion for the climate, though he also spent time challenging those such as Vitruvius, Mallet, and Buffon, who likewise ascribed supreme efficacy to the climate. In a nutshell, they reversed reality. Climate did not make human varieties, rather, human varieties were made for different climates. As he put it, there are different races of men fitted by nature for different climates. And this was the arrangement of divine providence. If we have any belief in providence, it ought to be so. Plants were created of different kinds, to fit them for different climates, and so were brute animals. Certain it is, that all men are not fitted equally for every climate. Is there not reason to conclude, that as there are different climates, so there are different species of men fitted for those different climates? Cultural mores, social customs, skin color, skeletal structure, differences in the very fibers on which Montesquieu's entire edifice was erected, these physical and moral traits were not to be thought of as the products of environment, they were from original nature. All of this pointed toward a seeming inevitability. Human diversity was primitive, not derived, and different races had their proper places. Like other key figures in the Scottish Enlightenment, notably Thomas Reid, Dugald Stewart, and Francis Hutcheson, Kames sought for a coherent theory of the human constitution. But whereas Scottish Enlightenment philosophy generally lodged its conception of the universality of human nature in an assumed monogenism, the data accumulated by geographers and anthropologists brought Kames to the brink of polygonism. According to George W. Stocking, Jr., Kames did not see any contradiction between arguing on the one hand that men were not all members of the same species, and on the other, that they were all equal and shared a common human nature. Paul B. Wood, by contrast, is of the opinion that Kames's contemporaries among the Scottish men of letters rejected his polygenetic inclinations as subverting the foundations of religion and morality. Whatever the implications for human ontology and wherever Kames should be located within the orbit of a Scottish common-sense tradition erected on the foundations of a universal human constitution, it seemed to Kames that God simply had created in different climates many human pairs with appropriately regulated physiologies. Indeed, reversing the very argument that Buffon had so confidently championed, Kames was sure that the history of colonization bore ample witness to the accuracy of his assertions. He could identify numerous instances in which colonists found it impossible to acclimatize to alien climatic regimes. Several European colonies, he reported, have subsisted in the torrid zone of America more than 2 centuries, and yet even that length of time has not familiarized them to the climate. They cannot bear heat like the original inhabitants. Moreover, Kames could not square Buffon's belief that Africans, Asians, Native Americans, and Europeans were the same human species, tinged only with the colors of climate, with the fact that diverse racial groups were to be found in places with the same climatic conditions. North America's regional climates, for example, had not produced corresponding racial types. Looking to climate was thus entirely wrong-headed. The American Indians must be a separate post-Adamic creation. As he explained in Book 2 of his treatise, America has not been peopled from any part of the Old World. Rather, he supposed the human race to have been planted in America by the hand of God later than the days of Moses, and that Adam and Eve might have been the first parents of mankind, i.e., of all who at that time existed, without being the first parents of the Americans. They were constitutionally different, and this enabled Kames to account for Americans' presumed demographic stagnation as a consequence of their inherent lack of sexual vigor. For all this unquestionable clarity, however, Kames ultimately felt the need to stop short of explicitly endorsing the idea of non-Adamic humanity. Perhaps it was because he had earlier been embroiled in theological controversy on the freedom of the will, perhaps it was because the idea was just too shocking. Whichever, Kames felt compelled to concede that the idea that God created many pairs of the human race, differing from each other externally and internally, and that he fitted these pairs for different climates, and placed each pair in its proper climate, was heterodox. For this opinion, he went on, however plausible, we are not permitted to adopt, being taught a different lesson by revelation, namely, that God created but a single pair of the human species. But while he affected to draw back from the skeptical heresy of pre- and co-Adamism and, in a desperate effort to avoid the charge of infidelity, proposed that God had impressed upon the human race an immediate change of constitution at the time of the Tower of Babel to fit it for its diaspora, his concession to orthodoxy was nothing but half-hearted. Though we cannot doubt of the authority of Moses, yet his account of the creation of man is not a little puzzling, as it seems to contradict every one of the facts mentioned above. It would be hard to conceive of a more hesitant endorsement of the standard Adamic story, nor one more shot through with insinuations about original human diversity. Certainly, Kames's critics could read between the lines. The Scottish common-sense thinker James Beattie, for instance, vigorously opposed the polygonism he detected in Kames, and indeed in David Hume, not least because of the racial bigotry he could discern in the very fabric of the theory. Kames was not a lone voice in raising skeptical doubts about the efficacy of climate's power. Griffith Hughes, 1707 ca. 1758, an Anglican clergyman, naturalist in Barbados and a Fellow of the Royal Society, was certain that climate's imperial rule was not without limits. In Book 1 of his Natural History of Barbados, a work that was not well received by his fellow natural philosophers, Hughes elaborated on a Montesquieu-like thesis to explain climate's influence on human temperament, and in particular why it was that inhabitants of hot countries are of a more volatile and lively disposition, and more irascible in general, than the inhabitants of the northern part of the world. His account centered on the impact of heat on the velocity of the fluids or animal spirits in the circulation of the blood. In climates where cold conditions restricted the motion of globules of blood through the capillary vessels, temperaments lacked the cheerfulness and levity of those in hotter climes. Yet for all that, the influence of climate was circumscribed. Crucially, it was impotent to explain differences in skin complexion and hair character. To be sure, some claimed that these features were the consequence of the intense heat of the sun. But Hughes was certain that this was far from being the truth. Instead, he considered that the whites, the Indians, and the blacks, differ not accidentally, but originally and really. Like Keynes, Hughes thought racial constitution was impervious to climate's power. Others, too, were prepared to risk heterodoxy in opting for originally different sources of racial derivation. The Royal Navy surgeon John Atkins, 1685–1757, for example, who became something of an expert in tropical diseases, appended some observations on the climatic and anthropological conditions of the Guinea coast to his 1732 work The Navy Surgeon, or, A Practical System of Surgery, in which he sought to account for differences in skin color. It was a phenomenon, he protested, that was extremely difficult to account for, and he confessed himself drawn to the conclusion that white and black must have descended of different protoplasts, and that there is no other way of accounting for it. He reiterated this judgment a couple of years later in his account of a voyage to Guinea, Brazil, and the West Indies, in which he announced that though it be a little heterodox, I am persuaded the black and white race have, ab origine, sprung from different colored first parents. Plainly, the idea of multiple atoms was now receiving a more widespread airing. It surfaced, too, in the work of the English surgeon Charles White, 1728–1813, who came to the conclusion that the various species of men were originally created and separated, by marks sufficiently discriminative. White had devised his multiple creation hypothesis after poring over the cabinet of human skulls in the possession of John Hunter and announced the opinion in his account of the regular gradation in man as a means of explaining the apparent graduated orders of human and animal species. A Fellow of the Royal Society renowned for his influential treatise on the management of pregnant and lying-in women and a founding member of the Manchester Literary and Philosophical Society, White drew on his own knowledge of human and animal anatomy, along with the reports of numerous natural philosophers and travelers, among them Edward Tyson, Carolus Linnaeus, Georges Louis Leclerc de Buffon, Johann Caspar Lavater, Petrus Camper, William Hunter, and in particular Samuel Thomas von Summering, some of whose findings he translated in an appendix, in his argument for a general gradation in physiological form from one species to another. It was emphatically not, however, a proto-evolutionary portrait, rather, it was domesticated in the tradition of the great chain of being that connected all living things together in a seriated hierarchy from the lowest to the highest. Indeed, he argued explicitly against any evolutionary style arrangement, insisting that those who preserve traditional monogenism, and thereby acquiesce to a too pliable interpretation of racial features, could find no way of drawing a stable boundary between humans and apes. As he put it, if we admit that such great varieties can be produced in the same species as we find to exist in man, it would be easy to maintain the probability that several species of simiae are but varieties of the species man. And if the argument be still further extended, almost all the animal kingdom might be deduced from one pair, and be considered as one family, than which a more degrading notion certainly cannot be entertained. Contrary to common assumption, monogenesis did not preserve human dignity, it subverted it. White's presentation of material on everything from skeletal structure and brain size to perspiration and varieties of hair thus led him to the conclusion that climate was powerless to explain the differences and that the only option was to concede that species were originally so created and constituted, as to be kept apart from each other. As for the biblical narrative, White was of the opinion that the Mosaic account of the creation is believed, by most rational Christians, to be allegorical. But even if it were literally true, there was internal textual evidence for another kind of mankind besides that descended from Adam. For we nowhere read of Adam and Eve having any daughters. Who then was Cain's wife, and whence did she come? In these judgments he consciously opposed Camper, who thought the whole human race descended from a single pair and sided with the opinions of Keynes and Edward Long. The lawyer and antiquary Edward King, 1734 5th–1807, who was elected to the Royal Society in 1767, pressed the internal biblical evidence for non-Adamic humans even more strongly in his dissertation concerning the creation of man, which appeared in 1800 as part of a set of additions to the second edition of his Morsels of Criticism. References to Cain's wife, the inhabitants of his city, the identity of the giants recorded in the Pentateuch, and such like, rehearsed many of the niggles that had long troubled attentive Bible readers, and King presented the pre-Adamites as the solution par excellence. While this treatise did not do much to enhance his reputation as a natural philosopher, it was popularly successful and delivered to readers a range of exegetical devices to support the existence of non-Adamic races. The central plank of his argument was that man was at first created of one genus indeed, and all of one blood, and in the image of God, but of different species, with different capacities, and powers, and dispositions, for very wise purposes. It was, he confessed, almost impossible to rest satisfied with believing that the white European, or Asiatic, and the black long-haired South American, the black curled-haired African Negro, the Cossack Tartar, the Eskimo, and the Malayan, were all descended from one common ancestor and mother. However ingenious and plausible Montesquieu's climatic thesis appeared to be, King remained unconvinced of its power to mold such dramatic racial differences. King's project embraced several dimensions, some of which invited political engagements. His advocacy of different species or classes, or what the Brahmins, in India, would call different castes of human, albeit within a single genus, for example, soon led him into talk about hybrid marriages, adulterated heritage, and racial mixing, and his designation of the Adamic family as the transcending class, supereminent in all qualifications and usefulness, who were distinguished by the appellation of the sons of God, reinforced that sense of racial hierarchy that a subsequent generation would press into the harshest of supremacist theologies. Well-formed language, true natural science, sound philosophy, architecture, and other blessings of high cultivation were the progeny of Adam's instrumentality. And, unsurprisingly, it was into this unmixed line of clear descent that the Messiah was born, a lineage markedly different from Cain, who, having debased his descent from Adam, had already married into an inferior caste, or species of mankind. Only the line from Adam's son Seth, this one family of the highest caste, continued unmixed down to the time of Noah. Besides all this, King claimed that even if the fall from grace had never taken place, the hierarchy of racial excellence that existed on account of different original species would have been advantageous for every racial type. Even the lower species, he conjectured, might, in consequence of that very difference, have received more enjoyment than they could have done in any state of excellence, where there was no such distinction. Evidently, hierarchical difference was built into the very fabric of the universe, and it had eternal ramifications. An eschatological component was thus intrinsic to his speculations about extra-Adamic humanity, who, to the utmost possibility that their respective faculties afford, would participate in the salvific accomplishments of the Adamic Messiah. But even if King concluded his excursus by expanding on the universal benefits of the true Adamic family, the potential for exploiting the narrative for different purposes was always there. King might be certain that the ruins of paradise, the Garden of Delights, are the riches of the world, and the faint resemblance of its arrangement, and improved order, the best blessing left by our first parents to the whole race of man, but others would readily read a less benign politics out of such a primeval anthropology. Adamic politics. Whatever their different accounts of racial character and human origins, politics of one form or another were folded into the Genesis narratives that monogenists and Pelagonists, supporters of the traditional Mosaic account and advocates of pre-Adamism, alike advanced. Moral cartography. As much as anything else, Montesquieu was engaged in the construction of a global moral geography on climatically controlled physiological principles. The distribution of the nervous glands in the human body in different parts of the world was such that different degrees of latitude were characterized by degrees of sensibility. The consequences for cultural politics were massive. Medically, susceptibility to pain was regionally differentiated. Morally, inhabitants of northern climates had few vices, many virtues, while in southerners the strongest passions multiply all manner of crimes. Mentally, hot climates produced people of indolence, with no curiosity, no noble enterprise, no generous sentiment. And there were military implications, even if undeclared, in such casual remarks as "you must flay a Muscovite alive to make him feel pain." Muscovite Russia, we might recall, was regarded by Montesquieu as an instance of Oriental despotism, a regime in which the lives and property of servile subjects were imperiously ruled over, it was supposed, by a single master. Goldsmith, too, elaborated a world-scale moral climatology, judging the Laplanders as rude, superstitious, and stupid and exhibiting all the virtues of simplicity, and all the vices of ignorance, the Tartars as composed chiefly of robbers, the Southern Asiatics as a feeble race of sensualists, too dull to find rapture in any pleasures, and too indolent to turn their gravity into wisdom, and the Negroes of Africa as a gloomy race whose climate had tended to relax their mental powers and render them stupid, indolent, and mischievous. The Europeans, of course, surpassed all these other groups and brought to perfection all those arts which might have had their invention among the other races of mankind. From his polygynous stance, Kames was no less willing to indulge in moral cartographics. Just as Montesquieu and Goldsmith elaborated a moral climatology of ethnic character, so Kames, working within a different explanatory framework, was every bit as happy to lay out a universal moral geography, with all the political ramifications that this view might imply. To him the savages of Guiana were indolent, the Ladrone Islanders great cowards, the Laplanders most timid, and the Macassars people of active courage. Montesquieu and Kames might differ on whether such characteristics were reducible to climate or were manifestations of original disposition, but the moral maps of humanity that they each constructed bore an uncanny likeness to each other. Human origins and the politics of slavery. How Adam was understood had implications, too, for questions congregating around the slave trade. Certainly, there was no simple correlation between beliefs about Adamic anthropology and positions adopted on slavery, though Ann Thompson has recently argued for significant links between materialism, irreligion, polygynism, and pro-slavery sentiments, on the one hand, and monogenesis, religious belief, and abolitionism, on the other, during the 18th century. But even if that boundary cannot be quite so confidently drawn, it is still the case that claims about human origins were often intertwined with debates about the morality of slavery. As early as 1680, the Church of England clergyman and missionary, first to Virginia and later Barbados, Morgan Godwin, wrote at length in support of the right of African slaves and Native Americans to be admitted to church membership in a tract for the Times addressed to the Archbishop of Canterbury. Rather sanguine about the practice of slavery itself, he vigorously argued their case in his lengthy 1680 plea on the Negroes and Indians Advocate, suing for their admission into the church. Godwin was fully aware that what he called the pre-Adamites' whimsy was being deployed first to derive our Negroes from a stock different from Adam's and then to brutify them. His intention, by contrast, was to prove the Negroes' humanity. It was a strategy diametrically opposed to those Spaniards, he seems to have had Sepulveda in mind, who had concluded that certain races were not human in order to justify their murdering the Americans. For all that, he acknowledged that fantastic, false, empty and silly, though the foul heresy of pre-Adamism was, its original author himself had never used it to dehumanize any racial group but, rather, had acknowledged the full humanity of the pre-Adamites. We are to take notice that their objected pre-Adamitism, doth not at all prejudice, nor even relate to this question, which is touching the homogeneity of our Negroes, not their origination or descent. That creation which they pretend to be antecedent to Adam's, being according to the principle of its first author, La Pereire, no less of real men than this latter, their posterity therefore must needs be such. So this pre-Adamitism doth utterly evacuate and overthrow whatever they from thence might otherwise infer. Yet his exemption of La Pereire from the charge of bestializing any ethnic group only served to underscore how well aware Godwin was of the theory's potential to shore up the politics of racial and ecclesiastical prejudice, and so, advertising the refutation that Matthew Hale had issued, he took pains to detail what he considered to be the incoherences of this irrational novelty. The political investment in the Adamic narrative was plainly of epic proportions, and not least in the realm of extending human rights to all racial groups. A century or so later, in his prize-winning Cambridge essay of 1785 on the topic "Is it lawful to enslave the unconsenting?", the abolitionist and Quaker sympathizer Thomas Clarkson called upon the hypothesis of climate to account for the emergence of the different skin tones of all races from an original dark olive color, a shade that was both beautiful and a just medium between black and white. He, too, was quick to draw out political consequences. This original skin tone, he reckoned, afforded a valuable lesson to the Europeans, to be cautious how they deride those of the opposite complexion, as there is great reason to presume, that the purest white is as far removed from the primitive color as the deepest black. Such considerations, Clarkson was certain, refuted the claims of those who urged that the black races were of a different species and were an inferior link in the chain of nature. And here the politics of climate plainly surfaced. The foundation was laid for his resolute rejection of the view that Africans had been made for slavery. On every front slavery was abhorrent. As he concluded, it is contrary to reason, justice, nature, the principles of law and government, the whole doctrine, in short, of natural religion, and the revealed voice of God. The published text of his essay, which appeared in 1786 under the title "An Essay on the Slavery and Commerce of the Human Species, particularly the African," had the effect of recruiting William Wilberforce to the abolitionist cause. It was the first of nearly 24 works dealing with slavery by one of Britain's most enthusiastic abolitionist pamphleteers. Around the same time, Reverend James Ramsay, surgeon, abolitionist, and sometime student of the Scottish philosopher Thomas Reid, was adamant in his discourse on African slaves that climate and other local conditions explain different cultural traits, and he thereby sought to rebut the infidel tendencies of those speculating about separate human creations. He had Kames explicitly in his sights as he rejected the speculation that the different human families had distinct progenitors in favor of the view that men had one common ancestor. With the backing of Scripture, this latter teaching was so conspicuous a feature of divine revelation that Ramsay was certain that we are not at liberty to pursue every wild conjecture. Much better, in his opinion, to recall that climate, diet and various modes of life have great power over the features, form and stature of man. Again, all of this was part and parcel of an anti-slavery political project stretching back to the 1760s that aroused the antagonism of influential planters in the Caribbean, where, as an ordained Anglican, he worked among slaves. Renewed vituperation from that quarter also followed the publication of the Essay on the Treatment and Conversion of African Slaves in the British Sugar Colonies when it appeared in 1784, as readers were told that vice never appeared in Africa, in a more barbarous and shocking garb, than she is seen every day in the most polished parts of Europe. See climate, mode of living, and accidental prevalence of particular customs, will account for many national characteristics. But the soul is a simple substance, not to be distinguished by squat or tall, black, brown, or fair. In different guises similar alignments are discernible elsewhere. In 1775 James Adair, an Indian trader in the southern Appalachians, possibly of Irish birth, urged that the American Indians were of Jewish origin and claimed thereby to have overthrown Kames's entire polygynous system, and more particularly the wild notion which some have espoused of the North American Indians being pre-Adamites, or a separate race of men, created for that continent. Despite their isolation and absence of the use of letters, they had retained the ancient standard of speech, and this feature, to Adair, pointed to their incorporation within the common laws of God in the creation of Adam. His conclusion was plain: the Indians have lineally descended from Adam, the first, and the great parent of all the human species. Adair's purpose in advancing this theory was in part to work toward a plea, in the final pages of his treatise, for a renewed society in which Native Americans would enjoy freedom and equality with their colonial neighbors. Although his voice and message were drowned out by war, Adair believed that, by delivering to them a Jewish heritage that antedated even European traditions, he was enhancing the Indian cause and providing them with high status. The politics of human genesis were no less a feature of those undermining in various ways the monogenism of Adamic anthropology. For all the apparent tentativeness that Kames advertised in his endorsement of a multiplicity of post-Edenic Adams, and however suspect the doctrine among the orthodox, such views were happily promulgated by those less unnerved by its taint of profanity, and not least for the theory's political possibilities. And yet the flow of the political tide did not always run in predictable channels. Charles White, who was attracted to the idea of multiple Adams, for example, declared himself an opponent of slavery. And an advertising flyleaf of the account of the regular gradation in man expressed its author's hopes that nothing advanced will be construed so as to give the smallest countenance to the pernicious practice of enslaving mankind, which he wishes to see abolished throughout the world. Again, in the body of the text he declared himself persuaded that the slave trade is indefensible on any hypothesis, and would rejoice at its abolition. And yet for all that, the project's political bias lay exposed on virtually every page. The African, he mused, seems to approach nearer to the brute creation than any other of the human species, and a few pages later he asserted, in whatever respect the African differs from the European, the particularity brings him nearer to the ape. On page after page European superiority in anatomy, intelligence, and beauty found expression, and carried away with a rhetorical cadence as he reached toward the finale of his text, he waxed Solomonic on the charms of the European female, the allure of a blush, that emblem of modesty and the graces of a bosom, tipped with vermilion. To cap things he provided a classification table of race mixtures, elaborating on the differences between a mulatto, a quadroon, a sambo, a mestiz, and so on, in terms of the proportions of white and black in the race mixture, down to detail of 15/16 black and 1/16 white, and further added a statistical theorem to predict the colonial effects of free and indiscriminate marriages of white and blacks. His reading of Polygonism into Genesis was nothing if not a project in cultural apologetics. White's contemporary, the Jamaican slave owner and planter Edward Long, was at pains to establish that the black races constituted a different human species and in so doing sought to undermine any suggestion that racial difference was simply an epiphenomenon of climate. It was in his 3-volume History of Jamaica, published in 1774, a work aptly described as a combination of polemics and propaganda, that long challenged Buffon's climatic account of racial difference. The transplantation of Africans into colder climates had failed to induce any hereditary modification, and this fact, long maintained, subverted the whole fabric of Mr. Buffon's hypothesis. To him it was much better to attribute dark skins to the direct work of the Creator. This polygynist apologia, moreover, was part of a strategy to justify the enslaving of Africans, whom he considered a subhuman, inferior species. They were void of genius, and seem almost incapable of making any progress in civility or science. They had no plan or system of morality, no taste for anything but women, gormandizing, and drinking to excess. With adjectival exuberance long stockpiled foul adjective upon foul adjective to bestialize Africans, in a single paragraph they were excoriated as brutish, ignorant, idle, crafty, treacherous, bloody, thievish, mistrustful, and superstitious, and a sentence later as proud, lazy, deceitful, thievish, addicted to all kinds of lust, incestuous, savage, cruel, and vindictive, devourers of human flesh, and quaffers of human blood, inconstant, base, and cowardly. All this was marshaled in favor of Long's rhetorical question, must we not conclude, that they are a different species of the same genus? The politics of plural origins were plain for all to see. The orang connection. To drive home his conclusion, Long had exploited human diversity to its fullest possible extent. Thus, while Oliver Goldsmith minimized differences between human races, in all the animal kingdom the differences between mankind are the smallest, he reported, Long did everything in his power to maximize them. And in so doing he worked hard to shorten the space between human races and the orangutan, indeed, to incorporate the orang within the human family and present it as savage man. Strenuously opposing Buffon's views on this matter, Long traced in some detail anatomical and behavioral correspondences between orang and human. Even on the issue of the distinctively human trait, speech, Long speculated that human organs were not given him, the orangutan, for nothing, and that orangs had some language by which their meaning is communicated. To be sure, the orangutan was far from our idea of a perfect human being, but it did come exceedingly close to certain human races. Orangs and blacks provided decisive links in the chain of being that connected brute creation with civilized humanity. And in this connection some of his most scandalous opinions saw the light of day. Not only did Long consider that both apes and slaves displayed comparable lecherous behavior, but he even went so far as to contemplate sexual relations between orangutans and certain African tribes. In language that abolitionists found utterly repulsive, he suggested that amorous intercourse between them may be frequent. The Negroes themselves bear testimony that such intercourses actually happen, and it is certain that both races agree perfectly well in lasciviousness of disposition. This of course confirmed the judgment he had issued just a few pages earlier that, ludicrous as the opinion may seem, I do not think that an orangutan husband would be any dishonor to an Hottentot female, for what are these Hottentots? There are, say the most credible writers, a people certainly very stupid, and very brutal. In many respects they are more like beasts than men. Shocking it might seem, but this, in Long's mind, was precisely what had been ordained by the divine fabricator when he created beings ascending through the various gradations of the intellectual faculty, from its rudimentary presence in apes to the utmost limit of perfection in the pure white. Such a polygynist doctrine fit perfectly the needs of a trader and Guinea slaves whose natural baseness of mind, he contended, seems to afford least hope of their being, except by miraculous interposition of the divine providence, so far refined as to think, as well as act like perfect men. All this was in keeping with his claims in Candid Reflections that African biology equipped black slaves for plantation labor. It was at this point of conjunction between human and orangutan that Long most conspicuously approached the writings of such other students of human nature as the 17th-century physician, anatomist, and Fellow of the Royal Society Edward Tyson, and his own Scottish contemporary, the legal philosopher James Burnet, Lord Monboddo. Tyson, who is credited with having conducted the first anatomical dissection of a chimpanzee, reported his findings in a 1699 discourse on what he called the orangutan, or pygmy. In a treatise that incorporated detailed illustrations of the creature's skeletal structure and other physiological features, he argued that the orang pygmy did not belong to the human species, as earlier writers, whose opinions he surveyed at some length, had supposed. In the past, he noted, the Antians were fond of making brutes to be men. On the contrary now, most unphilosophically, the humor is, to make men but mere brutes and matter. Whereas in truth man is part a brute, part an angel, and is that link in the creation, that joineth them both together. Yet he did acknowledge the creature's remarkable proximity to the human species and elaborated in detail how the orangutan or pygmy more resembled a man than apes and monkeys do and, correspondingly, how it differed from the human and approximated the ape. The specimen evidently occupied a transitional location in the chain of being, something like the way he considered the porpoise to be intermediate between fish and land animals, albeit firmly on the side of the animal kingdom. Nevertheless, he conceded that the connection was so strong that when he was describing the brain of our pygmy, readers could well justly suspect that he was describing that of a man. Long, who was certainly familiar with Tyson's conspectus, was evidently willing to narrow the gap further between orang and human, no doubt at least in part for the purposes of slave apologetics, and to that degree approximated yet more closely the views of James Burnet Lord Monboddo, the brilliant Scottish controversialist and associate of men such as Joseph Banks, William Jones, David Hume, Adam Smith, James Hutton, Dugald Stewart, and James Boswell. The contemporary debates surrounding whether or not humans shared with apes the upper intermaxillary bone, the bone that in human infants fuses with others to form the upper jaw but remains separate in apes, certainly kept the question open. Gouda's 1784 challenge to Petrus Camper, who, having dissected an orangutan between 1778 and 1782, insisted that humans did not possess the os intermaxillaire, not only revealed disagreement with Gall, that all species enjoyed a unity of structure based on homologous forms, but left the relationship between human and orang tantalizingly ambiguous. In Monboddo's case it was a concern with the character and origins of speech that led him to his controversial claims about the orangutan and his conviction that the creature was human. With a characteristic Scottish Enlightenment interest in the nature of human nature, Monboddo focused his concerns on the question of language, whether it was a natural attribute or an acquired achievement. His own position was crystal clear. Siding with Conde de Yock, he was certain that language was a human invention, not a natural endowment, and therefore not essential to human nature. To be sure, he considered that the capacity to acquire language was a human trait, but this emphatically did not mean that its acquisition was a necessary condition for human status. Bolstering his account with the testimony of ancient philosophers, none of whom ever dreamed that anything else was essential to men, except reason and intelligence, he confidently asserted that articulation is not natural to man. While his point of departure was an elucidation of the progress of the human mind, Monboddo came to acknowledge that the existence of society was a prior necessary circumstance for the evolution of language to take place. Having thus uncoupled the faculty of speech from intrinsic human constitution, Monboddo was certain he had opened the door to identifying creatures without articulate speech as human. This included what he believed to be certain African tribal groups bereft of language and, controversially, the orangutan. It was in the second book of his unfinished inquiry into the origin and progress of language that Monboddo turned his attention specifically to the account of the orangutan that Buffon and Linnaeus had delivered. By this stage of the argument he had already established to his own satisfaction that language had been constructed, that there must have been society before language was invented, and that, as he put it, while man in his natural state, is the work of God. As we now see him, he may be said, properly enough, to be the work of man. As such, Monboddo could confidently identify speechless human races, notably those wild races of men inhabiting the woods of Angola, and other parts of Africa. This sentiment, he acknowledged, had evidently given offense to some Christian readers, and so he went out of his way to protest the theological propriety of his speculations, maintaining that in the prolapsarian world the first human enjoyed many faculties belonging to his nature, of which he is now no longer possessed, and, among others, he may have had the faculty of communicating his thoughts by articulate sounds, which were understood, as soon as uttered, by those who heard them. But this natural faculty, as well as others, we may suppose that he lost upon his fall. The need to acquire language in a fallen world was, in fact, the consequence of the curse then pronounced upon him. Perfection, degeneration, progress, that was the linguistic sequence through which speech had passed. And with this schema firmly in place, Monboddo now turned attention to the orang and to his hypothesis that here was a barbarous nation, which has not yet learned the use of speech. Drawing on the earlier investigations of Tyson, Buffon, Purchas, Gassendi, and numerous other travelers and natural philosophers, he did everything in his power to humanize the orangutan and to bring the creature within the orbit of the human family. As he concluded, the substance of all these different relations is, that the orangutan is an animal of the human form, inside as well as outside, that he has the human intelligence, as much as can be expected in an animal living without civility or arts, that he has a disposition of mind, mild, docile, and humane, that he has the sentiments and affections peculiar to our species, such as those of modesty, of honor, and of justice. That they live in society, and have some arts of life. While Monbato's account, taken in the round, was comparatively bereft of the crudely racialist, pro-slavery language of Long, he nonetheless associated the orangutan with certain peoples whom he considered to be in a savage stage of human development, notably the Hottentots, the Iroquois, and various African peoples without the use of speech. His exposition, moreover, revealed him as sympathetic to a polygenetic reading of the origins of post-fall human language, when he declared that there was no reason to believe that it, language, was invented only by one nation, and in one part of the earth, and that all the many different languages are derived all from this common parent. There just was no one primitive language. Stanhope Smith and the Foundations of the American Republic. Monbato's proto-evolutionary account of the emergence of articulate speech from more primitive sounds and signs and his stadial portrayal of the progress of humanity rising from an originally a wild savage animal, till he was tamed, and humanized, by civility and arts, have latterly earned him much appreciation from those seeking for anticipations of present-day evolutionary orthodoxy. In his own time it was a different story. Indeed, he anticipated that his account would give offense to some, and in this judgment he was certainly not mistaken. Nowhere was this more conspicuously expressed than in the writings of the American clergyman-philosopher Samuel Stanhope Smith, professor of moral philosophy and subsequently president of the College of New Jersey, Princeton, who divined profoundly sinister political implications in Monbato's orangutan philosophy, in Cames's toying with non-Adamic human races, and in White's polygonist anatomy. There was nothing more contemptible than philosophers with solemn faces, retailing like maids and nurses, the stories of giants, of tailed men, of a people without teeth, and of some absolutely without necks. It is a shame for philosophy at this day, he went on, to be swallowing the falsehoods and accounting for the absurdities of sailors. The reason for this state of affairs, he reckoned, was at least in part an American one. We in America, he pondered, receive such tales with more contempt than other nations, because we perceive in such a strong light, the falsehood of similar wonder, with regard to this continent, that were a few years ago reported, believed, and philosophized on in Europe. In some ways Smith's critique, and his resort to environmentalism to preserve human unity, paralleled the reprimands that others had already issued to those who departed from humanity's traditional Adamic genealogy. But Cames's most conspicuous critic had domestic concerns in mind, too, and the particular setting he occupied at Princeton during the early years of the new republic added a distinctively American inflection to the debate. It was in his essay on the causes of the variety of complexion and figure in the human species, which first appeared in 1787 and then in an expanded form in 1810, that Smith determined to show that the unity of the human species was not only good science, it was also good theology and, even more important, good moral philosophy. Presented initially as an oration before the American Philosophical Society, Smith's analysis was the first American treatise devoted to the causes of racial variation in the human species, and it secured for its author an acknowledged place in the annals of American anthropology. William Stanton, for example, recorded that his book was the first ambitious American treatise on ethnology and long a standard work in the United States. The work was, in fact, an extended exercise in climatic determinism, so much so that Marvin Harris believed that here the ultimate pitch of environmentalism had been reached. In a nutshell, Smith insisted that climatic factors predominantly, but also social conditions, could fully explain racial variation. Polygonism was thus to be rejected. According to Winthrop Jordan, Smith's essay stands as a monument to American faith and environment. It was a special faith. Environmentalism had been an underlying animus in the Revolutionary era, and it towered as Americans stood poised and triumphant overlooking their magnificent continent. The salient features of Smith's assessment can readily be surveyed. Climate, migration, and attendant social circumstance were more than adequate to account for human variability. The distinguishing features of human societies were nothing more than responses to the influences of the climate, of the sterility or richness of the soil, of the elevation or depression of the face of their country, of the vicinity of seas or desorts, of their insular, or continental situation, or the modifications of all these, resulting from their occupation, and their habits of living. By reference to these geographical factors a single human constitution was preserved, flexible, to be sure, but common nonetheless. One implication of this commitment, of course, was that the human species had undergone some evolutionary modification, and Smith plainly embraced the doctrine of the inheritance of acquired characteristics as the explanatory mechanism. Another was human cosmopolitanism, Humankind was evidently capable of acclimatizing to the new climatic regimes, which typified zones of colonization. Smith, like his opponents, went on to expand on the regional geography of the human complexion. From the Baltic to the Mediterranean, he confirmed, the different latitudes of Europe are marked by different shades of skin color. Human hair, skeletal stature, forehead shape, physiognomic features, even mental powers and moral inclinations, were all correlated with climates, some states of society, and modes of living. Along the way he relegated to the realm of mythology the exotic tales of travelers who were only too willing to generalize from any little deviation from the ordinary standard in order to indulge in the most hyperbolic relations. Supremely, Smith's mechanistic environmental determinism, thoroughly characteristic as it was of Newtonian science, seemed to be confirmed in America's ethnological laboratory. A common origin and a shared nature, of course, did not entail ethnic or cultural uniformity, and Smith, evidently as accepting of cultural relativism as Montesquieu, accounted for savage life in terms of degeneration. Nevertheless, he remained convinced that differences between the races were literally only skin deep. He was certain, for example, that if the Anglo-American and the Indian were placed from infancy in the same state of society, in this climate which is common to them both, the principal differences which now subsist between the two races, would, in a great measure, be removed when they should arrive at the period of puberty. To be sure, this did not amount to modern egalitarianism, but it did confirm the unity of the human species. Whatever its scientific dimensions, Adamic rhetoric lay at the foundations of Smith's refutation of polygonism. He paraded Keynes, for example, as engaged in laudable attempts to disprove the truth of the Mosaic story and considered him an excellent specimen of the easy faith of infidelity. In the strictures on Keynes he quoted at length the Scotsman's seeming loyalty to the Genesis narrative, adding, "When ignorance or profligacy pretends to sneer at revelation and at opinions held sacred by mankind, it is too humble to provoke resentment. But when a philosopher effects the dishonest task, he renders himself equally the object of indignation and contempt." It was much same with his riposte to Charles White. "I cannot close these observations," he snapped without reprobating in the strongest manner, "that disingenuous mode of assailing the Holy Scriptures which has become fashionable with a certain class of writers, and which this gentleman affects to imitate. They speak of them with oblique and ambiguous respect. While at the same time, it is suggested that if we do believe them, it must be in spite of nature, and of the most certain physical facts. Thus do these authors study to undermine revealed religion by hinting that its friends require only implicit faith in opposition to all the truth of science. This mode of attack I cannot regard as either fair, or manly." The ironies in these exchanges, of course, are manifold. For in Smith, the self-appointed defender of orthodoxy, we find one who rejected special providences and thereby naturalized explanations by conceiving of God as building certain intrinsic qualities into the very stuff of reality. By contrast Keynes, the supposed infidel, resorted to miracle to explain the diversification of languages at Babel and clearly was far more supernaturalistic in his belief in separate human creations. Smith's achievement in branding Keynes as impious required, as Mark Noll has put it, considerable rhetorical finesse. And yet above and beyond matters of scientific evidence and theological decorum was politics. At base Smith's fundamental concern was the management of the moral economy. Science and theology alike were directly implicated in matters of social polity. For Smith what was at stake in researches into historical anthropology was nothing less than the constitution of society and the maintenance of the social order. Certainly, Smith was delighted that his own Baconian investigations served to confirm the facts vouched to us by the authority of Holy Writ, and he did not hesitate to elaborate in detail on what he considered to be the empirical errors of Charles White, whose claims were variously challenged as incoherent, inconsistent, and shy of evidence. For it was crucial to Smith that his anthropology did not rest solely on theological foundations. As he had made clear on the very first page of the treatise, the unity of the human race, notwithstanding the diversity of color and form under which it appears in different portions of the globe, is a doctrine, independently of the authority of divine revelation, much more consistent with the principles of sound philosophy, than any of those numerous hypotheses which have referred its varieties to a radical and original diversity of species. What was critical were the political implications of non-Adamic humanity. Were there different species of humans, they would be subject to different laws both in the physical and moral constitution of their nature. The empire of climate at once preserved human nature from pre-Adamite subversion, secured the intellectual integrity of moral philosophy, and delivered the promise of political stability. I must repeat here an observation which I made in the beginning of this essay, and which I trust I am now entitled to make with more confidence, that the denial of the unity of the human species tends to impair, if not entirely destroy, the foundations of duty and morals, and, in a word, of the whole science of human nature. No general principles of conduct, or religion, or even of civil policy could be derived from natures originally and essentially different from one another, and, afterwards, in the perpetual changes of the world, infinitely mixed and compounded. The principles and rules which a philosopher might derive from a study of his own nature, could not be applied with certainty to regulate the conduct of other men, and other nations, who might be of totally different species. The terms which one man would frame to express the ideas and emotions of his own mind must convey to another a meaning as different as the organization of their respective natures. But when the whole human race is known to compose only one species, this confusion and uncertainty is removed, and the science of human nature, in all its relations, becomes susceptible of system. The principles of morals rest on sure and immutable foundations. At bottom, what Smith found so offensive about the speculations of Keynes, Monboddo, and White about non-Adamic humans was that they were unsuited to the American project, in which it was vital, Smith believed, to have a common constitution to underwrite human morality. In the early days of the new American Republic, a confidence in a common human constitution was precisely the philosophy that was needed if public virtue were to be retained in a society that was busily repudiating the props upon which virtue had traditionally rested: tradition itself, divine revelation, history, social hierarchy, an inherited government, and the authority of religious denominations. And here the Scottish common-sense philosophy that Smith had imbibed during his student years from his soon-to-be father-in-law, John Witherspoon, was vitally important, for it insisted fundamentally on a universal human sensibility that netted together every single member of the human race. Without that unifying constitution, as he put it in the first edition of the work, any science of morals would be absurd, the law of nature and nations would be annihilated. The Scottish philosophy was thus, as Norman Firing observes, uniquely suited to the needs of an era still strongly committed to traditional religious values and yet searching for alternative modes of justification for those values. After all, James Madison, himself a former student of Witherspoon at Princeton, and the other architects of the Constitution required a ubiquitous human nature in order to undergird public moral order. Otherwise, the science of politics that Madison adumbrated in the famous 10th Federalist, showing his wholehearted endorsement of the Enlightenment style, would dissolve. From Witherspoon, Stanhope Smith knew how the Scottish philosophy, articulated by the Irish-born Francis Hutcheson, had developed a scientific and optimistic social theory that did not need to resort to the dictates of tradition and cultivated a moral Newtonianism that rendered ethics a species of physical science by appealing to a moral sense intrinsic to all humanity. It was only because there was a common human nature that it could be the object of empirical scrutiny. And it was precisely this idea that Smith's assault on non-Adamic humanity was designed to preserve in the face of seeming anthropological disruption. If, as Witherspoon was certain, a republic was right to break both with its monarchical past and religious establishment, and if republics, dependent as they were on the performance of public virtue, were the fragile thing Montesquieu had shown them to be, then morality could only be preserved in the public square if a universal ethical sense could be extracted from human nature by the methods of empirical science. Talk of non-Adamic races, different human species, multiple origins, and the like struck a blow at the very heart of the new America's moral economy. Small wonder that Smith and other moral philosophers in the fledgling republic did everything in their power to convey to their students the universality of the human constitution. Only that way could the nascent nation endure the stresses and strains that must inevitably come its way and prevent the vociferousness that otherwise would ensue. Adamic politics was the foundation on which the edifice of public order must be erected,